Welcome to our study hack video where we will be going over different ways that we process and retrieve information and along with some of the failures that go with them. Our first form of effortful processing is the spacing effect. We define the spacing effect as the strategy of studying in smaller increments rather than studying in one large block. Our example would be when Jimmy studies in alternating 30-minute increments over 10 hours rather than one large 5-hour block.
The second form of effortful processing is the testing effect. We define the testing effect as recalling a piece of information over and over to strengthen the memory. This can be defined as doing practice ACTs before the real ACT to improve your score.
Our third effortful processing is chunking. Chunking is the action of putting similar objects in small groups with each other mentally to remember them easier. An example of this can be when Sarah creates different categories for vocabulary terms so she can remember them easier for tests.
Now that we've gone over 3 different effortful processing methods to help you study, let's go over 3 different ways that we can retrieve that information to help us later. Our first retrieval method is priming. We define priming as unconsciously associating things with the learning of topics. Our example of priming is when Joseph is studying, he listens to rock music, and he unconsciously associates the rock music with the learning of the topics. So when he puts his earbuds in on test day and the rock music comes on, he remembers much more information from studying than he would if he didn't play the rock music.
Our second retrieval cue is context-dependent memory. We define this as retrieving memory best in the place where you've encoded it. Our example of this is Ron gets up to sharpen his pencil and he learns a vital piece of information at the pencil sharpener. Then during test day, in the middle of the test, he goes to sharpen his pencil, and at the pencil sharpener, he remembers the information that he learned.
Our third retrieval cue is state-dependent memory. State-dependent memory is when information is retrieved better when you're in the same mood that you were in when you initially encoded it or studied it. An example of this is when John studies his information in a rather calm state. And when he initially starts the test, he's not more or less panicked, but over time he gets calmer, and then he begins to remember his stuff.
Now that we've talked about 3 different methods of effortful processing and 3 different forms of retrieval cues, let's talk about some reasons why we forget that information.
Our first reason we forget is encoding failure. We define encoding failure as when information is not properly received and stored, therefore it's forgotten immediately. An example of this is when you read an entire page of a book and you remember none.
Our second reason for forgetting is the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. The definition of this is forgetting most of the information you encode quickly, but then you remember the rest for a long time. Our example is when Alex starts studying and forgets what he initially began studying, but he remembers what he studied afterwards.
Thanks for watching.
Hope you enjoyed.
And have fun studying.